We now have the pleasure of being joined by Terry Foy of Inside Lacrosse. Yes, everyone. Lacrosse season starts in a couple weeks. It's very exciting here in Syracuse. Basketball team not doing too hot. The lacrosse team hopefully going to go to the NCAA tournament, maybe even a Final Four this season in 2025. Terry, how's your offseason been? It was a great Final Four last year, and Syracuse just missed out on it, losing to Denver in the quarterfinals. How's your offseason been so far?
It's been great. Certainly a little less newsworthy than prior off seasons, which just means we get to focus more time on recruiting and finding the next stars of the game. So that was what was soaking up a lot of my time.
When you look at Syracuse, I mentioned they lost to Denver in the quarterfinals, 12-6 last year, first NCAA tourney appearance under Gary Gait, couple top five wins for the first time in the Gary Gait era. What's your biggest takeaway from last year on kind of Syracuse's path to reascension in college lacrosse under Gary Gait's tenure?
Am I allowed to take a victory lap? I know that I feel like I haven't been as right about anything as I have been about Syracuse over the last three seasons, each of the last three seasons. And so, I think that when you looked at their first year, there was a decent amount of veteran leadership that came back, but there was, a relative overall lack of talent. And it was going to be filled in by young guys that needed to learn how to win. And then, there was that was effectively year two. And so, there was just a ceiling on how good they were going to be because it takes getting your feet wet, understanding the length and the physicality of a college lacrosse season. And so, I felt like they were unlikely to make the NCAA tournament either of those first 2 years. And last year, I felt very confident that the quarterfinals was the line of demarcation. I felt like it was very clear to expect a home game in the first round of the NCAA tournament that they would be favored in, and that's what happened. And they took care of business against Towson. And that, projecting a Final Four was probably a little bit too aggressive relative to the rest of the field. And so, it was fair to expect them to make it to the quarterfinals. And really, I think to make it to the Final Four would have been to overachieve. Now, ultimately, I think in retrospect, you look at that matchup against Denver, and it's reasonable to come away disappointed because there were some ways in which that game could have unfolded in which the Orange would have won. But ultimately, the reason I think they didn't is the reason that I think there's a extreme cause for optimism heading into 2025, which is, that Denver team, there are 13 key contributors that are not on the team this year, right? Those were seniors. They had an opportunity to move on with their lives, but came back because they wanted to accomplish exactly what they did. And that is what they accomplished. And I think that when you really dive into the film of that quarterfinal matchup, that was the differentiator, right? Was how much some of that grit manifested over the course of the game, particularly at the defensive end, where Syracuse had so much trouble offensively. And I think that it's crazy because even though Syracuse is probably the second most veteran returning team behind Notre Dame in all of college lacrosse, they still don't have that many seniors that they're going to rely on. They just have a ton of juniors who have 2 years of experience under their belt. And so when you look at the rest of the field, there is one, two-time defending champion that I think has a very secure claim at number one. And then there's the Orange. And then behind them, I think there's basically two types of teams. One type, like Duke and Virginia, has a lot of talent because they're Duke and Virginia. I think you could throw Maryland into that bucket as well, but there's a lot of question marks. And then there's another type of team, and it's basically the upper end of the Ivy League. And I would put Yale, Cornell, probably Penn, probably Princeton into that group as well. And there are some parts of the roster that you really like, and then there are a few question marks. And that's basically the top 10. So it's shaping up to be as interesting of a college lacrosse season as we've had at least since 2021 or 2022. I mean, it feels historic, and yet there's some aspects of it where it's like you can't use language that's too strong because we're only 3 and 4 years removed from crazy seasons that were crazy in their own right.
Last season, Syracuse brought in a lot of guys from the transfer portal, eight, including Christian Brule and then Jake Stevens, Sam English from Yale. This season, it wasn't really that. They do have a lot of guys returning, but they only brought in two, one of them being Michael Grace from RIT, D3 school, and then the other Ryder Ochoa from St. John's, who didn't get much action last year. One might have thought Syracuse might have added more than two guys, even though they have a lot coming back. Why do you think that the transfer portal wasn't a big priority this offseason?
I think there are two reasons. The first is because they didn't have as many areas of need to address. Specifically, I think the two easiest areas to address through the transfer portal are at face-off and in goal. And I think you saw them make an active decision not to address the goalie position in the portal, and I'll get to that in a second, because it really closely ties in with the second reason, which is because really the crown jewels of this, so to speak, transfer portal offseason were the Ivy League players who had their additional year of eligibility because they didn't play the 2021 season that everybody else played. Generally speaking, the talent in the transfer portal was not as high as it was 2 years ago. And one of the two guys that you mentioned, in Michael Grace, actually made the decision. We knew he was going to be coming to Syracuse prior to the 2024 season. So there's an aspect to which he doesn't even really apply, because, they made that decision before the 24 season unfolded. They made that decision without all the information that they made, all the decisions not to bring in transfers over the summer of 2024. And so I think the point that I brought up, Luke Stout is a Syracuse native, Loyola graduate who entered the transfer portal and ended up going to Johns Hopkins. He is an example of what would have been a very logical player for Syracuse to answer, Syracuse to offer out of the transfer portal. And the fact that they didn't, to me, just suggests, even though they have to replace their goaltender in Will Mark, they like what they have on the roster, and they didn't want to upset the apple cart, upset the chemistry, whatever metaphor you want to use, in order to be able to just kind of infuse a talent that you didn't even know if it was going to end up starting. So I think that was ultimately what led to the approach from a transfer portal kind of non-activity standpoint.
You mentioned the special teams, and both special teams players for Syracuse, the starters last year, leaving Mason Cohn, Will Mark. John Mullen pretty much slides there at the X pretty seamlessly. He went on last year, towards the end of the year, to really catch fire at the X. And then Jimmy McCool, the anticipated starter. If you ask some people within the Syracuse program last year, they were talking about how good Jimmy McCool was looking in practice, even while Will Mark was starting. What do you expect from the special teams for Syracuse with, Jimmy McCool and net, John Mullen at X, kind of bouncing back or continuing what Will Mark and Mason Cohn did to start last year?
Well, Mason Cohn is a special athlete, a special player, so I think he was going to be difficult to replace regardless. And I think that the face-off position is also, I don't want to say it's difficult to predict, but it falls in line with much of what these conversations are going to sound like until we actually start seeing the games happen. When you consider, the rest of the top 10 that I just mentioned, you look at how many other teams graduated their faceoff guy and don't necessarily have a clear option because those faceoff guys took 1,000 faceoffs or more over the course of their career. Luke Weirman and Jake Naso are two of the top 10 most winning faceoff guys in the entire country. And another one, or I'm sorry, in the history of college lacrosse. And another one is going to be who you play in your first game, who just left Jacksonville. So the point is that there is so many question marks across the landscape of college lacrosse at the faceoff dot that even though Johnny Mullen doesn't necessarily have loads of experience, and you certainly would like to see a little bit more depth developed behind him, because it tends to be a position where, guys take knocks, and certainly with some of the rule changes, there's going to be question marks that arise there too. There's no reason to be down on it or even to doubt Johnny Mullen's ability to be successful because of the fact that he's coming back with more experience than a lot of the guys that he's going to be going against over the course of the season. And, from the standpoint of Jimmy McCool, I mean, obviously, he was a highly touted player coming out of high school. I was well familiar with his game, and I feel like he's the type of goalie, and I don't know, I'll say this. He is a goalie for whom his positioning in the net and his ability to make assured saves is more his game, as opposed to the kind of flashy highlight reel save that maybe Will Mark might have been better associated with. And the reason I bring that up is because, to me, that style of goaltender is way more part of the 7-man unit than the guy that steals goals is. And so I think Jimmy is going to marry even better with the increased experience and continuity of the 6 guys playing in front of him, and especially with a second-year defensive coordinator where everybody understands what's being asked of them even more clearly, and you can take what was kind of the year one guiding light, which was make everything simpler. You still, like, the staff is still going to try to make it as simple as possible, but you can make it a little bit more complex than you did last year because you have that foundation to build on. And so I think, I'm going to evaluate Jamie's performance way more hand in hand with the defense's overall performance than I did with Will the last 2 seasons.
Something that intrigued me about last year's team, obviously, the year before, the faceoff X was the biggest problem on Syracuse, both at the X and on the wings. And Syracuse brought in Jake Stevens from the portal. They had Sam Alexo. They brought in Matt Wright from the portal. All really good guys on the wings of the faceoff. That were really good at getting ground balls if a Mason Cone or a John Mullen couldn't win it to themselves. How critical do you think it's going to be to replace those guys on the wings to be able to control possession for Syracuse this season?
Well, I mean, I think it's going to be critical, but I think that you've got built-in options, right? I think Sam English is about as good of a one-for-one replacement for Jake Stevens as you could find. And who knows, Michael Grace might be just as good of a replacement, might be an improvement over Sam Alexo. So I feel like, it is important, but at the same time, there's no reason that I wouldn't expect it to be successful. And that's one of the other elements of Syracuse's faceoff game that I like, which is that, Jake Spallina represents a really nice counter option because in addition to the fact that stylistically he's going to be very different from Mullen, he's also the type of player that can stay on and play defense. And what that means from your ability to, sub game or kind of grind clock or whatever the case may be, there's just a lot of flexibility there. And so that's going to be something I'm going to watch particularly early on as well.
We'll touch on the top dog in just a second, but this offense is bringing back a lot of good pieces. Michael Leo, Owen Hiltz, Vin Thompson, Sam English, Luke Roa, even throwing Jackson Birtwistle into that mix. All on the offensive side. Pat March is going to have a lot of help going into SU's offense next season. How much of that do you think will help the continuity with Pat March and the offense and the facilitating that goes around with Syracuse?
I think continuity is going to be really important, but I don't know that it's even as important as individual skill development. And that's crazy to say, but I think it was something that we saw out of the aforementioned unnamed top dog from year one to year two, and there's reason to expect it to be the case with him as well as a lot of his teammates, just because, playing so much lacrosse and high level consequence stakes laden lacrosse between June 1st and, October 31st or whatever it was has value. And Joey Spallina played a lot of big time lacrosse over the summer. And, a guy who you didn't mention in Trey Deer played a lot of big time lacrosse over the summer as well. So I think the point is that there's just a lot of optionality. There's a lot of kind of fluidity in terms of the way in which they can put guys on the field and expect them to be comfortable in a bunch of different roles. And so that's why I put familiarity, even though it's very important, a little bit farther down the pecking order of things that I think are going to make this offense even better than it was last year, at least covering for the talent that they did graduate in guys like Christian Muley and Jake Stevens. And it's going to be because the players themselves got individually better, and that improvement will allow them to play all over the field in ways when maybe they were a little bit more kind of stuck into a particular role last season.
Something that interests me is in terms of all that depth, and you mentioned Trey Deer, they have basically four guys on attack they can put on at any given moment, whether it be Trey Deer, Joey, Michael Leo, Owen Heltz, whether they would slide one of them up to the midfield potentially to get all of them on the field. But you mentioned Joey Spallina. He's number one recruit 2 years ago. In his third season now, coming off 88 points. Where do you think Joey's at in his development, both, at Syracuse and playing box over the summer? And do you think he can be the player for Syracuse that leads them in big games that they're going to be in this season and potentially an NCAA tournament?
Yeah, I think he's right where he should be in terms of his individual player development. And I think that the question that is going to be asked about him this year is how does he manage when he's being guarded by opposing number one defenseman and that is limiting his production? How does he still impact the game? And I think what's interesting is the question of how much that responsibility falls to him versus how much it falls to Pat March and the way in which the offense in total is being orchestrated. So, there are some guys, Lyle Thompson, this was absolutely the way that Albany played in opposing defenses, when they were trying to shut him off and trying to take him out of the game. Well, one of his teammates would just intentionally miss a shot and he would restart off the end line. And then he'd have an opportunity to attack the opponent's number one defenseman. Is that what Syracuse wants to do? Do they want to be as behind the cage, attack oriented from an initiation standpoint as they are in some of their blowouts against inferior competition when they're playing in the highest leverage games? Because I think what I saw last year when I was watching them was they were, if not midfield dominated, certainly more midfield oriented in those games against the likes of Cornell and Notre Dame and Virginia and Duke than they were in the other games when they were way more attack oriented. So it felt like a stylistic choice. And I do think that by virtue of just seniority, right, and having another year under your belt, you can kind of as Joey Spallina, or to your point, Owen Hiltz or Michael Leo or whoever it is, say like, no, we're going to start this possession with the ball in my stick, as opposed to a midfielder dodging out of the box.
You mentioned Trey Deer. Is there another player, or it might even be him, that you look out for as a rising star in Syracuse's offense that might not have the name recognition as Joey Spallina or Owen Hiltz or Michael Leo?
Well, I mean, I'm going to cheat a little bit and say that I think Michael Leo is probably the most underrated player in college lacrosse right now, insofar as like, if you were to say who could be a first team All-American that many people aren't thinking about right now, I mean, I would say like, all right, name the player, give me a list of players in order from the likelihood that they are a first team All-American. Just on this roster, he's probably like sixth or seventh on most people's lists. And for me, he's like third, probably, behind Joey Spallina and Billy Dwan. And so that is just a function of, how special of a player I think he is, and how proficient I think he is at his role. In terms of the kind of players down the offensive list, so to speak, I mean, I think you can look at it and say, the top 6 or 7 is like pretty well set. So what we're really talking about is, kind of that eighth and ninth offensive player, the other two middies, I guess, on the second midfield line. And the short answer is like, I don't know. I think if you're only basing it off of last season, I would put money on Tucker Kellogg and Wyatt Hoddle as being the two guys, assuming that Wyatt Hoddle doesn't reprise his D-Midi role that was among the most surprising things that happened to anybody who watched him play high school lacrosse. Those would be the two guys right now that I would say, okay, I see the path most obviously for them, but based on the fall practices or, the handful of practices I'm sure they've already had this spring, or freshmen that we don't even know about, it's very possible that there are other guys who are going to crack into that space that I'm just unaware of.
Yeah, I can't say I was not shell shocked when I saw Wyatt Hoddle go out on short stick defensive midfielder next to Carter Rice. Not only he's definitely skilled, but the size of Wyatt Hoddle and the fact that he came in as an offensive midfielder. But speaking of the defense also returns a lot of guys, pretty much other than their goaltender. Riley Figueres, Billy Dewan, Kane Cole, all back at long pole. Carter Rice back at the short stick. You mentioned about making the defense a little bit more nuanced this year and in year number 2 against with John O'Dearna. How good do you think this defense could be in the country? Do you think they could be like a top 10 or a top 5 defense with how much continuity they have?
Yeah, I think they can absolutely be a top 10 unit. I think a top 5 unit is probably a bridge too far just based on how good the opposing offenses that they're going to play this year actually are. And that is, one of those stats where face-off proficiency actually has a lot to do with it because, assuming we're talking about efficiency as opposed to scoring, the obviously we're talking about scoring defenses, then the amount of possessions your opponent has, that matters a lot, right? But even from the standpoint of efficiency, there is a degrading effect in terms of just how much defense you have to play because you get fatigue and everything that goes along with that. So, I think that you mentioned Riley Figueres, and maybe that was an oversight when I was given my list of players that can be first-team All-Americans because, you put him and Billy Dwan side by side. It's kind of a pick your poison or it's a preference of taste as opposed to who's the more effective. And I think that's a really special position to be in, especially in the ACC, and especially this year where, there aren't going to be a ton of teams that have 2 number 1 attackmen in the way that there had been the last couple of years, right? With Connor Schellenberger and McCabe Millen, or, Brennan O'Neill and Josh Zawada, or Pat and Chris Kavanaugh. I think that now the assignment is going to be way more about how similar are they physically, right? And are you better served to guard big strong guys or little quick guys? And then conversely, if one of those guys gets put into a position where the guy he's guarding is a matchup that he's certainly going to win, well then how can he take advantage of being a disruptor? And so those are the elements of the personnel development, especially against a lot of their high leverage opponents, that I can see manifesting in a way where they can cause a lot of turnovers and generate a lot of offense out of the defense in ways that maybe it's not the top five efficiency defense because of the goals they're going to give up to really good offenses, but it is clearly improved year over year in the way that they're making plays all over the field and making the offense's job easier.
So as we mentioned, Syracuse's schedule just came out last week. Their schedule this year is a little different from last season. One of the things that highlights that is no Hobart. My mom was a statistician on the Hobart lacrosse team back in the day under Dave Urich, who just tragically passed away. And what does that not playing that rivalry mean? And how do you compare last year's schedule to this year's schedule?
Yeah, I mean, I'm always of two minds when it comes to um, the loss of traditional rivalries, particularly regional ones, because they certainly serve a huge purpose, and there's no denying it. There are usually considerations and circumstances that go into it that don't make it to the public, and those can be mitigating in some respects. I mean, this is a team that this is a schedule that has a lot of traditional rivals. A lot of the traditional rivals are now conference rivals, right? So Virginia, for instance, North Carolina, a rivalry that was suspended because of how acrimonious it was, and now is back and returned. And then obviously Johns Hopkins, and then a relatively new rival in Maryland that at least coming off the regular season meetings that these two teams have had, specifically last year, and how dramatic that finish was, it would be a shame to lose that game. And then I think one of the things that could be a consideration or a reason that we lose some of these traditional rivalries is because there are just more teams, and there are more teams that want to play games. And so, now we get an opportunity to see Syracuse travel to Utah. Like, tell that to somebody who was on the 1983 championship team and see, their brain on the inside of their skull, just based on how unlikely that would have been 41 years ago. And then the new addition in Harvard, which is a really intriguing game for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is that Jerry Byrne is also reaching the crescendo with his program in terms of some of those guys that were on. It's weird because he's in year 6, but really he's kind of in year 4 based on the way that the pandemic shook things out. This is Sam King's team, right? He's a senior, and so this is their opportunity to capitalize on that cresting wave. And adding Syracuse to the schedule is clearly a hallmark, so to speak, or a statement that they're trying to do it. And then with Towson being a February 10th game, and you get an opportunity for the Tigers, who I would imagine are still going to be pretty pissed off about the way that their last trip to the JMA Wireless Dome ended their season. There's a lot of very rich stories and storylines in this schedule, and I think it's one that Syracuse fans should and will savor, even if it doesn't include what was one of the more one of the better traditional rivalries in the sport.
I'm definitely happy that the Utah game is on a Saturday this year and not Wednesday at 12:30 because of
I
all
actually
the
love
flight
that.
problems. You did?
Weekday lunchtime lacrosse is absolutely up my alley. Certainly not the case for everybody. So I totally get where you're coming from on that one.
I didn't mind it. It was a good lunchtime during the game, and then before the post game show, good lunch hour. I know one that I'm looking at. One game is the Cornell game on Long Island, especially fact that it is on Long Island. What is the game that catches your eye in terms of the one you're looking forward to most on Syracuse's schedule this year?
Well, it would be that one if you didn't take it. So that's going to be played at Mitchell Stadium, where Nassau Community College plays. It's going to be, run very similarly to last year's Notre Dame Cornell game, which was one of the best games of the season, as was last year's Syracuse Cornell game. So now you take both those things,
That was
kind of
nuts.
combine them. It's going to be pretty epic. But the Notre Dame game, I mean, how can you not? It's a preseason 1 versus 2, at least in my opinion. Notre Dame has certainly kind of had their way with the Orange. It's really kind of crazy. I mean, we're going on like a decade. I was at the 100th team celebration game that got out of hand. I believe that was in 2016. And I think that there was another one 2 years after that, and then obviously the Jake Taylor return game 2 years ago. So the Fighting Irish have enjoyed their trips from South Bend to the Dome, and so this is going to be one where I would imagine Gary has his team's attention from the standpoint of the value of protecting home, not just because of the likelihood that it's a really, really important quality win, and certainly has the likelihood of helping to set the seeding in the ACC tournament, but also because there's some pride protection on the line here as well.
Yeah, Syracuse has struggled against Notre Dame to say the least the last couple of years. And last year they went into Notre Dame with a I think a good shot, and then they just came out pretty slow to start, and that kind of put them behind the eight ball. It was funny. I thought about it just now, but the Hobart game, Rick Beardsley always loved talking to us about the Hobart game and that rivalry. You mentioned Syracuse would be, potentially your number two team in the preseason poll, and you mentioned the ACC tournament. It was the first year it's back last year. Are you a fan of the ACC tournament coming back? And how do you think that impacts, I guess, the way they play the regular season now that they only play, the one game against each team, and then they get a potential second shot right before NCAA tournament seeding comes out?
I'm a fan of the ACC tournament in the sense that it was a huge part in catalyzing the creation of conference tournaments, and in general, I'm a enormous fan of conference tournaments. I think conference tournament weekend is the best weekend in college lacrosse. The ACC tournament, I'm not a fan of in the sense that, there's just this like dangling participle, the fifth team that has no home, and they have done all sorts of things to try to figure out the best way to make it work. And there is no solution is effectively the answer that they have come up with. It's not for an AQ, so, the stakes aren't the same as they are for the other conference tournaments. And most of these teams know what their postseason fate looks like before the tournament actually gets started. So, like I said, I mean, relative to the other conference tournaments, the games feel a little less meaningful, and yet they are really incredible games. So I hope you can accept 6-1, half dozen the other in terms of my relationship with it. In terms of how you play for it, I mean, I get the sense that these coaches kind of coach the entire season. You might as like Will Smith has flashed the thing from Men in Black in front of their eyes, and they just have no expectation that the ACC tournament actually exists. And then all of a sudden it's ACC tournament week, and they're like, "Oh crap, we got to play these teams again! Oh my god!" So, yeah. And then they just, kind of treat it like a mini Final Four weekend, and some of them actually, I think I'm convinced, like to lose so that they can get out of there and save the legs after what is a very long and stressful and strenuous April. So that, again, that's just kind of why I have a fraught two-minded relationship with the ACC tournament.
No, I follow that pretty much in the same. It's always fun to see like the Big Ten tournament last year with Michigan making a run to get that AQ. And conference tournament weekend, no matter what the sport, I feel like is always a fun thing, whether it's basketball, lacrosse. And I can tell you, Syracuse fans are much looking forward to Syracuse men's lacrosse this season, this year in 2025. Thanks again for taking the time, Terry.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me, fellas.